The stone moved. Marcelline Ravenscroft pressed her back against the cold museum wall and watched, breathless, as 7-foot carved figure in the center of the basement chamber shifted, cracked, and breathed. Not metaphorically, not artistically. The chest of the statue actually expanded, a sound like a glacier splitting rolling through the underground room, and every single light in the building flickered and died at once. She should have run. She knew she should have run. Every rational thought in her head, the same thoughts that had kept her alive for 3 years of running from people far more dangerous than any museum exhibit, screamed at her to turn around, climb back through the ventilation shaft she had crawled through, and disappear into the London night. Instead, she stepped closer. The cracks spread from the statue's chest outward, grey stone falling in sheets like a shedding skin, and beneath it she caught the first glimpse of white. Not the white of marble, the white of skin, of hair, of something that was absolutely, undeniably not stone and never had been. The figure's head dropped forward, and a sound came out of it that Marcelline felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears. A sound of pure, ancient, furious relief. Long white hair spilled forward across a face that would have stopped traffic in daylight, angular and severe and beautiful in a way that made the word beautiful feel insufficient. His eyes opened. They were silver, not grey, not pale blue. Silver like liquid metal, and they found her in the darkness of that room with an immediacy that told her he had known exactly where she was before he ever opened them. "You," he said. His voice was the voice of old castles and winter mountains, rich and low, and carrying the weight of something that had been silent for a very long time. "You broke the seal." Marcelline did not move. She was good at not moving when something dangerous looked at her. She had learned that skill the hard way. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I touched the wardstone by accident. I was just trying to steal something," he said. Not an accusation, an observation made with a precise, detached tone of someone who had catalogued human behavior for centuries and found most of it predictable. She straightened her spine. "To take back what belongs to me." That made him pause. The last fragments of stone fell from his shoulders, from his arms, from his hands, and he stood before her in what she could now see was ancient armor, black and silver, and etched with symbols she did not recognize, but felt, the way you feel a warning before the words reach you. He was enormous. Not in the way of gym-built men or security personnel she had spent years evading. Enormous in the way of something that had once been worshipped and had never quite forgotten it. He studied her with those silver eyes. "Your name?" Marcelline Ravenscroft. Something moved through his expression, something that was not quite recognition and was not quite surprise, but lived in the space between them. "Ravenscroft," he repeated, very quietly. "Yes," she said. "And you are Hadrian Varcolac." He said it the way rulers say their own names, as a declaration rather than an introduction. "Commander of the First Court Sentinel Guard, sealed by the blood law of House Morvain 312 years ago." His silver gaze dropped to the shattered wardstone on the floor at her feet, then rose back to her face. "And you, Marcelline Ravenscroft, have just made yourself the most dangerous woman in the vampire world." She had been the most dangerous position she could be in for 3 years running. She lifted her chin. "Then I suppose I should find out why." The museum alarms began screaming 3 floors above them. Hadrian moved before she processed the sound, crossing the room in a way that was not quite human speed and not quite the blurring teleportation of old vampire stories, but something in between that was deeply, viscerally unsettling. He caught her wrist, not roughly, but with a certainty that communicated very clearly that letting go was not something he intended to do. "There are things in this city," he said, his voice dropping low as the alarms wailed, "that have been waiting for me to be unsealed for 300 years. They will have felt the ward break the same moment you did. We have perhaps 4 minutes before they arrive." Those silver eyes held hers with an intensity that she felt like a physical pressure. "I will explain everything, but not here. Trust me for 4 minutes, and I will earn the rest." Marcelline Ravenscroft had not trusted anyone in 3 years. She looked at the ancient vampire commander who had been sealed in stone by a blood law she did not understand, who knew her surname with an expression she could not read, whose grip on her wrist was iron but had not hurt her once, and she made a decision that her rational mind would argue with for weeks afterward. 4 minutes, she said. Starting now. He moved them through a door she had not seen, because it had not been there before. He pressed his palm to the wall, and the stone remembered it was a door. The London Underground passed above them in rumbles as they moved through tunnels that smelled of cold earth and old water. Hadrian matching his stride to hers with the careful, automatic consideration of someone who had once walked beside humans and had not forgotten how. He did not release her wrist. She noticed distantly that she did not ask him to. "The Ravenscroft name," he said as they walked, his voice careful and measured, "carries a specific weight in vampire court history. There was a compact made in the year 1712 between House Varcolac and the human family Ravenscroft. A mutual protection agreement, sealed by ancient vow and renewed through every generation." Marcelline processed this. "My family made a deal with vampires. Your ancestors saved the lives of 17 of my household during the great purge of the human hunter councils," he said. "They hid them, fed them, sheltered them for 2 years at enormous personal risk. The ancient vow of protection was the only thing House Varcolac could offer in return, and it was not given lightly. A Varcolac blood vow does not expire." He paused. "It also means that anything threatening a Ravenscroft heir is, under blood law, automatically a threat to my house." She stopped walking. He stopped too, turning to look at her with those silver eyes that reflected the faint bioluminescent growth on the tunnel walls like mirrors. "The people who have been hunting me for 3 years," she said slowly. "The ones I have been running from. Are they servants of House Morvain?" he said. "Yes. Who are the people who sealed you in stone?" "Yes." The tunnel all breathed around them. Somewhere above, London traffic moved with ordinary ignorance of everything happening beneath it. "Then my accidentally breaking your seal," Marcelline said. Working through it with the methodical intelligence she had applied to every crisis of the past 3 years, was not an accident. Hadrian's expression shifted, and it was the first time she had seen something genuinely complex move through those austere features. "No," he said, "I do not think it was, though I do not believe you were conscious of the design. The wardstone responded to your blood, to your surname. I believe someone arranged for you to be in that museum, in that basement tonight." "Someone used me as a key," she said. "Someone used you as a key," he confirmed. Marcelline Ravenscroft had been used as a tool by enough people to have developed a very particular kind of cold fury about it. She felt it now, clean and sharp and clarifying. "All right," she said. "Tell me everything. Starting with who sealed you, why they sealed you, and what exactly the blood law of House Morvain means for both of us." He told her. They walked as he talked, moving deeper into a network of tunnels that he clearly knew from memory. And she learned that Hadrian Varcolac had been the most feared and respected commander in the vampire world for approximately 4 centuries before the current age of concealment. When vampires had retreated from open human society and established their courts in hidden places beneath major cities, in converted castle complexes under Scottish moorland, in deep countryside estates that appeared abandoned from the road and were anything but. He had served the First Court's primary sentinel, the guard commander whose oath was to protect the ruling bloodline of the entire vampire nation, an ancient and sacred post that had existed for as long as vampires had gathered in courts at all. The First Court was not the most powerful court in terms of sheer numbers, but it was the oldest, and its legitimacy was recognized by every vampire house in existence. House Morvain was the second court, ambitious, calculating, and patient in the way that only immortal things can be patient. Their lord, a creature called Ceravain Morvain, had spent the better part of 2 centuries looking for a way to challenge the First Court's authority without triggering the mutual destruction that an open war between ancient vampire houses would cause. His solution had been elegant in the way that truly cruel things sometimes are. He had manufactured evidence of a betrayal, had presented it to the First Court's ruling council in Hadrian's absence, had played on old grievances and ancient pride, and had convinced the council to seal their own most powerful protector in stone, under the blood law provision for commanders who had broken their oath of loyalty. Hadrian had returned to the court to find himself already tried, already condemned, already sentenced. He had been given no opportunity to speak. The blood law of House Morvain invoked as the governing provision meant that Seravain Morvain himself held the seal and could release it at will, essentially holding the First Court's greatest weapon in his personal possession without ever taking it openly. 312 years, Marcelline said when he finished. Locked in stone while the person who framed you held the key. Yes, and the First Court never realized the evidence was fabricated. The evidence was very good, Hadrian said, with a control in his voice that she recognized as the management of a wound that had not healed. And I had not been present to offer a defense. By the time any doubt arose, the blood law was sealed and could not be undone without Morvain's consent, or the death of his bloodline, or a Ravenscroft heir breaking it accidentally, Marcelline said. The Compact of 1712 contained provisions I was not fully aware of at the time of my sealing, he said. It seems the Ravenscroft blood vow was woven into my original oath of service in ways that created a secondary release condition, a Ravenscroft heir, in genuine need of protection, standing at the site of my imprisonment and touching the wardstone. He looked at her steadily. The ancient vow recognized its obligation. Marcelline thought about this. She thought about it for a long time as they walked, her mind turning the logic over and examining it from multiple angles, because she had learned that the solutions that seemed most convenient were usually the ones with hidden costs. This secondary release condition, she said, was it known to Seravain Morvain? The pause was infinitesimal, but she caught it. It must have been, he said, which means that whoever arranged for you to be in that museum tonight did so in service to Morvain's enemies, or as a component of a larger design I cannot yet see. Or, she said quietly, Seravain Morvain himself arranged it, knowing that releasing you would force your return to the vampire world under his terms. Hadrian stopped walking. She felt him process this, felt the weight of it moving through him, and she understood that this ancient, devastatingly powerful creature had not considered this possibility, because he was still thinking, like the commander he had been, looking outward for his enemies rather than examining the design of the trap itself. If he released me, Hadrian said slowly, on his own terms, using a Ravenscroft heir as the mechanism, the ancient vow of protection activates. Which means you are now oath-bound to protect me, she said. Which means I am now oath-bound to protect you, and must remain in your proximity to do so, and cannot return to the First Court without bringing you under their protection as well, which requires a formal court presentation which Morvain could use to force a confrontation on his chosen ground, she finished. With you by my side, oath-bound and unable to refuse, and me as the human liability that can be used to control you. The tunnel hummed around them, and Hadrian Varcolac looked at Marcelline Ravenscroft with something in his silver eyes that was newer and more complicated than anything she had seen there yet. You worked that out faster than I did, he said. I have had 3 years of practice identifying when someone is using me as a piece on their board, she said. You had 300 years of stone to process. Something that was almost a smile moved across his severe and beautiful face. Then we are in agreement that walking directly into a court presentation would be a catastrophic mistake, she said. Yes. Good. He turned. And she noticed that the direction he chose now was different, away from wherever he had originally been leading. She appreciated that he changed course, without arguing, without explaining that he knew better, without any of the 100 condescending variations of dismissal she had learned to expect from people who considered themselves powerful. He simply adjusted. Then we need somewhere safe to think, and I need to find someone I trust, which is a considerably shorter list than it was 3 centuries ago. I know what that feels like, she said. He glanced at her sideways, and this time the almost smile was more definite. I imagine you do. They emerged from the tunnels through a service entrance into a narrow Soho alley, sometime after 2 in the morning, the city loud and indifferent around them. And Marcelline pulled her jacket tighter against the November cold, while Hadrian stood beside her and looked at the modern city, with the carefully contained wonder of someone who had been removed from time for 3 centuries, and was not prepared to show how disorienting that was. She did not comment on it. She simply waited until he had oriented himself and then said, I have a place, nothing impressive, but it's clean and it isn't known. I have been careful about that. Your safe house. 1 of 3, she said. I have learned to maintain options. He looked at her then, with a directness that felt evaluating, not in the way of someone measuring her as a threat, but in the way of someone revising their understanding of who they were looking at. You have been surviving alone, hunted by Morvaine's servants, for 3 years. Yes, without any knowledge of what they were. I knew they were not ordinary. Beyond that, no. She began walking toward the main street, and he fell into step beside her with that same careful calibration of speed she had noticed in the tunnels. I thought I was involved in something human, a corporate secret, something my father had been mixed up in before he died. Your father. There was something in his voice, not quite guilt, something adjacent to it. He died 4 years ago, she said. Car accident, officially. I started finding things in his study afterward, documents, a kind of journal. It took me a year to understand what any of it meant, and by then someone had already broken into my apartment twice. When a third attempt came, I left. She glanced at him. I have not stopped moving since, Marcelline. He said her name with a weight and a care that caught her off guard, and she made a mental note to be more careful about how much his voice could do to her composure. Your father's death was not an accident. She had known this. She had known it in the way you know something that you cannot prove and cannot afford to fall apart over, so you store it in a locked room inside yourself and keep moving. Having it spoken aloud by someone who clearly knew the truth of it still hit her with a force she had not anticipated. She kept walking. Her voice came out steady because she had practiced making it steady. Morvaine? Morvaine's servants. Your father had begun researching the C-1712 compact. He had found documentation that connected it to the blood seal on my imprisonment. I believe he was very close to understanding that Morvaine had manufactured my conviction, which would have given the first court grounds to reopen the case, she said, which would have everything Morvaine had built on having you out of the picture. Yes. She walked in silence for half a block. Then, with the particular and very personal fury of someone who had spent 3 years grieving and running and being angry without knowing exactly what to be angry at, she said, "We are going to end him." Hadrian did not tell her that was impossible. He did not tell her to leave it to him, or that it was too dangerous, or any of the reasonable things that someone less honorable might have said to manage her expectations and her role in what was coming. He said, "Yes, we are." The "we" landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. The safe house was a top-floor flat in a Victorian conversion in Clerkenwell, accessed through a management company that existed only on paper under a name that had never been connected to Marcelline Ravenscroft. She had spent one of her last £3,000 setting it up, and she had never once regretted it. The flat itself was small and functional, and very deliberately characterless except for the books, because she had never been able to stop buying books, and the stack of notes and documents that covered the dining table, which she swept into a folder automatically as she entered. Hadrian stood in the middle of the room and looked around, and she watched him take in the locks, the secondary exits, the organized emergency bag by the door, the notes she had not been quite fast enough to hide. "You have been investigating this yourself," he said. "I told you I found my father's documents. I have spent 3 years trying to understand what killed him." She set the folder down and turned to face him fruitfully in the light for the first time, and promptly had to recalibrate again. Because lamplight and the close confines of a normal human living space did something extraordinary to the way he looked, making him simultaneously more real and more impossible. His armor was archaic and wrong for the setting, and yet he inhabited the room as though it owed him the space. "You should sit down. 300 years is a long time." He looked at the chair as though the concepts of sitting were something he was remembering from a great distance. Then he sat, with the deliberate, considered grace of someone who did everything deliberately and with great consideration, and Marcelline found herself thinking that there was something almost unbearably moving about. Watching something ancient and powerful occupy an ordinary chair in a London flat and let itself, just fractionally, be less than entirely composed. "Tell me what you know," he said. "What you have found in 3 years," she told him. She laid out everything, with the methodical precision she had developed out of necessity, the documents from her father's study, the names she had traced, the pattern of disappearances in the London vampire community that a human would not normally have access to, but that she had mapped through obituaries, property records, and careful conversations with people who turned out to be half-bloods and dampirs and other edge-of-the-community individuals who were easier to find than full vampires if you knew what to look for. Hadrian listened without interrupting, and this itself was remarkable, because she was accustomed to being interrupted, summarized, corrected. He listened with the absolute, unsettling attention of someone for whom listening was a skill refined across centuries. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, with a restrained intensity that she felt like a change in air pressure, "You found Serafine Morvine's secondary court, or—" "I found references to it," she said. "I do not know where it is, but you have narrowed it." He looked at her notes folder. "May I?" She handed it over. He opened it and began reading with a speed that was not quite human. And she watched his expression as he went through pages of her careful, painstaking research, and watched something move through his face that she recognized after a moment as respect, offered without ceremony or condescension, simply acknowledged in the way he handled the documents. "This building," he said, tapping a page with one long finger. "Beneath the embankment. You marked it as a possible." "The ownership chain is deliberate obfuscation," she said. 6 shell companies deep. That kind of structure is not used for anything ordinary. "It is the secondary court," he said with certainty. "I know the architectural specifications Morvain favored. He would have built underground, close to the river, with access to the old underground river channels for transport that avoids surveillance." He set the folder down and looked at her. "You were closer than I suspect," Morvain realized. "Maybe that is why the pressure on me increased recently," she said. 3 months ago, the people following me got more aggressive. I had to move twice in 1 week. Because you were getting close." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, and the lamplight carved his face into something that belonged in an old painting, severe and beautiful, and carrying an enormous weight with very visible effort. "Marcelline, I want you to understand something clearly. The ancient vow that binds me to your protection is not a burden I resent. But it is also not the reason I intend to ensure Serafine Morvain does not harm you or anyone else connected to what he has done. The vow is obligation. What I feel when I consider what was done to your father is something else entirely." She met his silver gaze. "What do you feel?" "Fury," he said simply, "and a debt. Because your family protected mine when mine could not protect themselves. And the consequence of that loyalty was your father's death and 3 years of your life spent in fear. A Varcolac does not carry a debt like that without acknowledging it." She swallowed. She was not accustomed to people acknowledging her specifically, her losses, her cost. "You were in stone," she said. "You could not have prevented it. No, but I can prevent what comes next." He stood then, and she stood too, because the energy in the room had shifted into something purposeful and forward-moving, and she said, "What do we need?" "First," he said, "we need to contact the one person within the first court I trust absolutely. My second-in-command when I was sealed was a woman named Ileana Draculeshti. If she is still living, she will have spent 3 centuries waiting for a way to clear my name. She is the most dangerous political operative in the vampire world, and she will not have been idle. How do we contact her without Morvain knowing?" "She will have a dead drop," he said. "A method of contact that we established before I was sealed for emergencies that we both understood might outlast our ability to communicate normally. The location was a specific shop on Portobello Road that has, I suspect, changed ownership several dozen times since I last visited it." He looked at her with the steadiest expression she had seen from him yet, which was saying something because his default expression was already profoundly steady. "It is possible we will encounter Morvain's surveillance before we can reach it. I will not allow them to take you. But I want you to know the plan so that if anything separates us—" "Nothing separates us," she said, with a firmness that surprised her slightly. "We move together. You know the vampire world, I know the human infrastructure. Both of those things are going to matter before this is over." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his silver eyes something softened infinitesimally, like ice at the very first moment it considers becoming water. "Together," he agreed. They moved out into the city at dawn, which Marcelline had half expected to be a problem for him, and which turned out to be precisely handled by a long coat and a hat that she supplied from the emergency bag, because she had found over the past 3 years of researching vampire-adjacent communities that the sun was genuinely damaging to full-blood vampires, not instantly fatal as the old stories claimed, but painful and progressively weakening with sustained exposure, and that most of them managed it simply by being nocturnal or sufficiently covered in daylight hours. Hadrian accepted the coat and the hat with dignity, and wore them as though he had chosen them, which she appreciated for its sheer commitment. Portobello Road on a Saturday morning was exactly the chaos she had always found simultaneously overwhelming and useful. The market covered the chaos of two people who were moving with purpose and checking sight lines, and the antiques and vintage sections were full of people doing exactly the same kind of careful searching that she and Hadrian needed to do without attracting attention. The shop was a small antique and curiosity dealer near the northern end of the market, currently operating under the name of a third-generation family business dealing in Victorian and Edwardian objects. Hadrian paused outside it with the controlled stillness of someone managing a significant emotional response, then walked through the door. The owner, a small, sharp-eyed man in his 70s, named, according to the sign, Bertram Aldous, looked up from behind the counter and very still, and then said, in a voice entirely without surprise, 3 decades I've kept that back room for you, your lordship. Hadrian stood a little straighter. Bertram Aldous, you are the 4th generation of your family to hold this position. 5th, said Bertram, with the serenity of a man who has long since made peace with his place in something far larger than himself. My grandmother passed it to my mother. My mother to me, and I to my daughter, though she does not know the full nature of it yet. My instructions were to maintain the drop point and to send word the moment you walked through that door. He reached under the counter and produced a sealed envelope, dark wax, no markings. Your second in command has excellent instincts. This arrived 2 days ago. Marcelline met Hadrian's gaze. 2 days ago she had broken his seal. Whatever Ileana Drocolesti had sent had arrived before he was even free, timed to be here when he arrived. He broke the seal and read the letter with that inhuman speed, and then he held it out to Marcelline without hesitation, which she took as a gesture of trust so natural it clearly had not required deliberation, and she read it herself. Ileana Drocolesti's handwriting was small and precise and completely legible, despite presumably being written by a vampire who had learned penmanship in an era when it was an art form. The letter laid out, with extraordinary efficiency, the following. She knew the seal had been broken. She had been monitoring the ward for exactly this possibility for 300 years. She had spent that time building a case against Seravain Morvain that was, in her assessment, irrefutable. She had 2 members of the original Conviction Council who had, in the past century, privately recanted their support for the verdict after discovering inconsistencies in the evidence presented to them. She had witnesses. She had documentation of Morvain's manipulation. She was, at the time of writing, preparing to bring the full case before the First Court sovereign, who had ascended to the position 80 years ago and had no personal stake in the original conviction. She was also, the letter noted, aware that a Ravenscroft heir had been instrumental in the breaking of the seal, and that this placed said heir in immediate and severe danger. She had arranged a location, an address in Kensington, secure and unknown to Morvain's network, where they were to come immediately and not through the underground tunnels, which she suspected were being watched. She knows everything, Marcelline said. Elena always knows everything, Hadrian said. And the warmth in his voice, when he spoke of his old second, was the first genuinely soft thing she had heard from him. The first indicator of the depth of what had been taken from him. It is simultaneously her greatest gift and the reason she was never boring to work with. They thanked Bertram, who waved them out with the calm efficiency of a man who had done his small extraordinary part and was satisfied with it, and made their way to Kensington. The address was a townhouse that appeared ordinary from the street, and was absolutely not ordinary the moment the door opened. The woman who opened it was tall, dark-haired, and had the white skin and ancient steady eyes of an old vampire, and she looked at Hadrian for a long moment with something vast and relieved and fiercely contained, moving through her expression, and then she said, in Romanian accented English that was elegant and slightly archaic, You look terrible for someone who has been resting for 3 centuries. You look insufferably satisfied with yourself, Hadrian said. I have been waiting 312 years to tell you that your faith in the First Court's good sense was catastrophically misplaced, Ileana Draculesti said. I have earned some satisfaction. She stepped back to let them in, and her dark eyes moved to Marcelline and held there with the penetrating attention of someone filing away every detail. And you, she said, are Marcelline Ravenscroft. Yes, said Marcelline. Your father was a brilliant and brave man. Ileana said directly, with the blunt compassion of someone who does not soften truth but means every word of it. I am sorry we did not find a way to protect him in time. That failure is mine, and I will not make it again. Come inside. The inside of the townhouse was part working intelligence center and part something that felt like a preserved piece of an older world, old furniture and older books alongside contemporary technology. Screens showing surveillance feeds and digital documents laid over surfaces that had been built to hold candelabras. 4 other vampires moved through the space with quiet efficiency, all clearly Ileana's people, all giving Hadrian the kind of careful, covert reverence that told Marcelline he had been, in the world he had been taken from, a figure of real and serious significance. Ileana laid out the plan with the same efficiency her letter had demonstrated, and Marcelline listened and asked questions, and noted the points where she disagreed and said so, and watched Ileana's dark eyes sharpen with something like approval at each interjection. The core of the plan was this. Ileana would present her compiled case against Morvain to the First Court sovereign, a 300-year-old vampire named Erzebe Vasiliev, at a formal convening she had already requested, and which could not be refused under blood law procedures. The presentation of new evidence in a sealed conviction case triggered mandatory review. Morvain would be notified, as was required, but would have no legal mechanism to prevent the review from proceeding. The problem was Morvain's response to notification. He will accelerate, Hadrian said. He will move against Marcelline immediately. If he can eliminate the Ravenscroft line entirely, the secondary release condition is negated retroactively, and my release becomes legally contestable. He cannot reseal you once the review is initiated, Ileana said. The blood laws does not permit it, no. But if Marcelline is dead, the protective oath that I activated on my release is voided, and without the oath as evidence of the release condition, the review has a significantly weakened foundation. He would kill me, Marcelline said, not as a question, specifically to weaken the legal case against him. Yes, Hadrian said, and the word came out with a quiet, controlled intensity that communicated very clearly that he found this prospect not frightening but personally offensive in a way that he intended to address comprehensively. Then, we do not give him the time, Marcelline said. You file the review application today, Ileana. File it before Morvain knows the plan has progressed this far, and in the meantime Hadrian and I go to the secondary court. The room went quiet. The secondary court beneath the embankment, she continued, because she had been thinking about this since the safe house, and she had not talked herself out of it yet. In my research I found references to a document, something my father called the Morvain cipher, a record of Seravain Morvain's own communications during the period of Hadrian's conviction. If it exists, and if it is there, it is the original evidence that Morvain manufactured the charge, not a reconstruction, not witness testimony. The actual documentation of the conspiracy, in Morvain's own hand. The cipher would be definitive, Ileana said slowly. There would be no contestation possible. But going into the secondary court, one of Ileana's other vampires said carefully from the back of the room, with Morvain almost certainly already knowing the seal is broken, is extremely dangerous, Hadrian said. Yes. He looked at Marcelline. You are not suggesting you go alone. I am not suggesting I go alone, she said. I am suggesting we go together. You know his court architecture and security structures. I know the building on the embankment, and I have maps of the access points, including one access channel that I believe is unmonitored because it predates Morvain's use of the building. She met his silver eyes. The document alone makes the case irrefutable. Without it, there is still room for Morvain to contest, to claim that Ileana's reconstruction is fabricated. With it, there is nothing. Hadrian was quiet for a long moment. She could feel him calculating, assessing, running scenarios, and she could also feel something else happening beneath the calculation, something that was about her specifically, about the weight of what the ancient vow meant when it encountered the reality of her being in danger by design. "If anything happens to you," he said, low and precise, "while you are under my protection, the oath demands that Then nothing happens to me," she said. "You are the most formidable guard commander in vampire history, according to everything I have read about you in 3 years of research. If I cannot be safe with you, I cannot be safe anywhere." Something moved through his expression that was not quite the almost smile she had seen before, but was more than that. "You researched me." "I researched everything related to my family's situation," she said. "You were prominently featured. And what did you conclude?" She held his gaze, "that you were framed by someone who understood that the best way to destabilize an entire court structure was to remove the person everyone trusted most. Which tells me that you were exactly as good at your post as the records suggested." Ileana made a sound from across the room that was, Marcelline realized, the vampire equivalent of clearing a throat at an inappropriate moment. Hadrian turned back to the room with the careful dignity of someone who is being slightly undermined by their own expression and is extremely aware of it. "We go tonight," he said. "Ileana, begin the review application immediately. Have it filed before midnight." He looked around the room at the people who had waited for him across centuries, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and certain, and carried everything that 300 years of betrayal and silence had not managed to break. "We end this." They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing, reviewing Marcelline's maps of the embankment building, cross-referencing them with Hadrian's architectural knowledge of Morvaine's preferred security patterns, identifying the pre-Morvaine access channel she had located through city archives, and confirming, as best they could from the outside, that it was indeed unused in the current configuration. During those hours, in the quieter spaces between planning, she learned more about him. Not the commander in full, not the sealed figure from the museum basement, but the person, the being who had spent 4 centuries as the strongest protector in a world full of things that needed protecting and had still, somehow, been taken from that purpose by one carefully constructed lie. He asked about her too. He asked about her childhood, her relationship with her father, the 3 years of running. He asked without prying, with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that some things needed to be offered rather than extracted. She found herself telling him more than she had told anyone in years, because something about his manner made silences feel safe and words feel heard. "You are not what I expected," she told him at one point, as they sat at opposite ends of the large table with maps between them and the afternoon fading outside the townhouse windows. "What did you expect?" "Something less human," she said honestly. "Something colder." He considered this. 3 centuries of stone did not do what Morvaine intended, he said. He believed that isolation and immobility would break whatever remained of my sense of self. What it did instead was give me an extremely long time to examine every belief I had ever held about duty, loyalty, and what those things actually require. He looked at the maps and then at her. "I think I am more human than I was before the sealing, and considerably less willing to defer to authority simply because it claims the right." She thought about her 3 years. "Isolation changes you," she said. "If you let it make you adaptable instead of bitter." "You chose adaptable," he said. "I tried to." "You succeeded," he said, with the certainty of someone who had excellent grounds for assessment. When darkness came, they moved. The access channel to the secondary court was a pre-Victorian drain passage connecting to the old subterranean river fleet, long since culverted but still physically present beneath the city, its stone courses maintained by the fact that London tends to preserve things it buries rather than destroy them. The opening was exactly where Marcelline had calculated. Behind a maintenance panel in the Fleet Street and ground car park that required a specific tool she had prepared in advance, Hadrian moved through the darkness with absolute ease. The moonlight from street-level grates doing nothing to illuminate their passage, but being quite sufficient for his perception. He stayed at her shoulder in the narrow passages, not ahead of her, not directing her path from behind, but beside her in a way that felt both protective and equal. The secondary court existed, as Hadrian had confirmed, in a deep level beneath the riverside buildings. Its construction incorporating old Roman stonework into Morvaine's own medieval tastes, a hybrid of eras that was genuinely disorienting to move through because nothing quite matched, and yet everything was impeccably maintained. They encountered the first guard at the transition from the access channel to the court's outer corridor, and Hadrian dealt with him without violence, using a compulsion command in Old Romanian that left the guard in a confused, cooperative state that would not be noted by any monitoring and would not leave marks. Blood law prohibits killing members of another court's household without formal challenge, he murmured to Marcelline as they moved past the confused guard. Even in a break-in, old codes have their inconveniences. I appreciate the ethics, she murmured back. The secondary court was dark and grand and deeply unsettling in the way that places built for power always are when stripped of their regular population, and Morvaine's aesthetic ran, she noted, to the explicitly menacing in ways that the first court's records had suggested was overcorrection from someone deeply insecure about his own authority. They moved through 3 levels, using Hadrian's knowledge of how Morvaine structured his secure spaces and Marcelline's knowledge of the building's original architectural bones, and found the document vault on the second subterranean level, exactly where the intersection of those 2 knowledge bases suggested it would be. The vault lock was blood-sealed. Old magic, layered and complex, requiring Morvaine's own blood to open by conventional means. There is a secondary opening condition, Hadrian said, examining the lock with the attention of someone who had spent centuries studying exactly this kind of sealed architecture. Every Morvaine blood seal has one. He built them as fail-safes, in case of the inconvenient loss of the primary bloodline member. He looked at the surrounding stonework. There is a pressure configuration embedded in the stone. If you press the ward points in the correct sequence, the lock interprets it as a conditional emergency release. How do you know the sequence? Because it is based on the same underlying mathematical pattern as every blood seal constructed in the 18th century, and I spent 300 years in stone, with nothing to do but work through every mathematical principle I had ever learned. He looked at her with those silver eyes that held a particular kind of quiet humor she was coming to recognize. Occasionally immobility is instructive. Press the points, she said. He did, with careful precision, and the vault door opened. The document was there. The Morvaine cipher, a collection of communications bound in dark leather and indexed in a handwriting that matched the style of the 18th century, detailed and damning. She recognized her father's marginalia on some of the photocopied pages, and she understood that her father had actually accessed this vault, had photographed these documents, had brought copies home and hidden them in his study. He had died for what he had found here. She took the originals and she took the copies, and she thought about her father as she moved, and she let herself feel that for exactly as long as it took to secure the documents inside her bag, and then she sealed the emotion back up and moved. They were 3 levels up and 50 meters from the access channel when the lights came on, all of them. Simultaneously, the secondary court flooded with the cold, blue-white illumination of emergency protocols, and from the corridors ahead and behind came the sound of coordinated movement, and Marcelline understood in the same instant that Hadrian's posture shifted into something entirely different, that they had been anticipated, not discovered, she realized immediately. Anticipated. Seravain Morvaine had known they would come here, and he had let them, and he had waited. Hadrian turned to face the corridor behind them, and she turned to face the one ahead. And she had the knife from her jacket pocket in her hand before she had consciously decided to reach for it. And she thought with one clear, cold thought that she had known this was a trap within a trap and had come anyway because the document was worth it, and that whatever happened next, they had the document. The vampire who emerged from the corridor ahead of Marcelline was not Seravain Morvaine. He was a lieutenant, older than he looked, with the specific coloring and bearing of a Morvaine court vampire, white-sticked and dark-eyed, and smiling the particular smile of someone who believes they control a situation completely. Commander Varcolac, the lieutenant said, addressing Hadrian but watching Marcelline. Lord Morvaine extends his welcome and requests that you and your human companion accompany us to the upper court, voluntarily if possible. The alternative is also available. The alternative, Hadrian said, with a quiet that was more dangerous than any volume could be, would require you and your people to be prepared to face the consequences of moving against a Ravenscroft heir under ancient compact. I trust you understand what those consequences are. The compact, the lieutenant said smoothly, will be significantly less relevant shortly. Lord Morvain has initiated a formal challenge to the secondary release condition. The review application filed this evening by Hadrian Varcolac has been temporarily suspended pending the outcome of the challenge. Until it is resolved, the protective oath is in a state of legal contestation. He was very pleased with this. She could hear it. A suspended oath, Hadrian said, is not a voided oath. No, but it is sufficiently ambiguous that moving against the Ravenscroft heir constitutes a legally defensible action under the challenge provisions. The lieutenant smiled again. Lord Morvain is thorough. He is, Hadrian agreed. He always has been. He glanced at Marcelline, just briefly, a look that communicated a very specific message, and she received it with the precision that came from hours of working in close partnership. Then he looked back at the lieutenant. I have a counteroffer. The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. Single formal challenge, Hadrian said.
Morvain and myself, Old coded.
The outcome determines the legal resolution of all contested matters simultaneously. If I lose, the review application is voided, the compact is dissolved, and Marcelline Ravenscroft leaves this court unmolested. If I win, the review proceeds, and Morvain's challenge is dismissed. The lieutenant's smile faltered very slightly. Lord Morvain has not authorized. Then ask him, Hadrian said. Because the alternative is that I invoke the blood law provision for unprovoked aggression against a reinstated sentinel, which triggers mandatory first court military involvement within 6 hours, and I promise you that Ceravain Morvain has considerably less appetite for open warfare than he does for careful manipulation. A pause. Then the lieutenant produced a phone, very modern and incongruous against the court's atmosphere, and made a call. Marcelline moved closer to Hadrian, in the silence of the wait, and he shifted slightly toward her, without breaking his line of sight to the corridor, and she said very quietly, "This was your plan from the moment the lights came on." From approximately 25 seconds after the lights came on, he said, equally quiet. I needed those 15 seconds to assess the number of people in the corridors and confirm that direct engagement would be extended and costly. The single challenge, she said. Can you win it? He looked at her for just a moment, and his silver eyes in the emergency lighting were extraordinarily direct. Yes, he said, I can win it. You have been in stone for 3 centuries. Your strength has been rebuilding since the seal broke, he said, rapidly. And Ceravain Morvain has spent 3 centuries managing political machinery rather than fighting. He is older than I am, but age is less relevant than practice when the application is direct. He held her gaze. I can win it, Marcelline. She looked at him, at this ancient and devastating and surprisingly gentle creature who had spent 300 years immobilized and come out of it still thinking about protecting the people he was sworn to, and she said, I know. The lieutenant closed his call. Lord Morvain accepts. Ceravain Morvain was not what she had expected, which she suspected was entirely deliberate. He was silver-haired and refined and looked, at first impression, like a diplomat rather than a creature who had destroyed lives with careful patience across centuries. He received them in the upper court chamber, with the gracious ease of someone hosting a social occasion, and his eyes moved to Marcelline with a calculation that she met without flinching. The Ravenscroft girl, he said pleasantly. Your father was remarkably persistent. It seems it runs in the family. It does, she said. His eyes moved at the bag on her shoulder, and she watched him register the weight of it, and she watched the calculation behind his eyes shift as he understood that they had already recovered the cipher. He smiled, and it was a smile that contained approximately nothing warm or genuine. The document changes very little, he said. Without a valid review proceeding, the review proceeding, Hadrian Varcolac said from the chamber entrance, is valid. She had not come alone. She had come with 6 of her own people, and more significantly, with a tall, composed, immensely powerful-looking vampire in formal court attire, who carried herself with the settled authority of someone who has governed for 3 centuries and has no need to demonstrate it loudly. Erzébet Vasiliev, sovereign of the first court, looked around Seravaines-Morvain's secondary court chamber with the particular expression of someone who has arrived at a location that exists in violation of multiple protocols and intends to note every single one. "Lord Morvain," she said, "your challenge application arrived. I reviewed it personally and denied it." The review proceeds. She looked at Hadrian, and something moved through her composed expression, something that was old and complicated and genuine. "Commander Varcolac, it has been a long time." "Sovereign Vasiliev," he said, with a bow that was both perfectly correct and completely individual, the bow of someone who respects authority when it has been earned. "It has." Seravaines-Morvain's composure cracked for just a moment, and in that moment Marcelline saw what lived beneath the diplomatic surface. The genuine fear of the creature who has built an entire structure on a lie and has just watched the foundation move. The formal challenge still stood. Morvain had accepted it under old code, and under old code, an accepted challenge could not be withdrawn without conceding all contested matters automatically. He had built his legal strategy on the assumption that the review would remain suspended, and Erzsébet Vasiliev had come here personally to remove that assumption. He had to fight. The challenge was conducted in the formal style. The chamber cleared. The old words spoken in Old Romanian that Marcelline did not understand but that clearly carried specific legal weight, and then Hadrian Varcolac and Seravaines-Morvain stood on opposite sides of the chamber, and Marcelline watched. She had seen people fight before. She had never seen anything like this. Vampire speed and vampire strength applied with 4 centuries of technique on one side, and 3 centuries of political survival reflexes on the other. Morvain was not what Hadrian had suggested, was not simply a politician who had gone soft. He was dangerous, old, and deeply motivated by the imminent end of everything he had built. He fought with genuine ferocity. Hadrian fought with something else. He fought with 3 centuries of accumulated intent, with the purpose of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, with the controlled, absolute proficiency of someone for whom combat was not a skill but a nature. And Marcelline's breath caught in her throat twice when Morvain came close and then released completely. Each time, Hadrian absorbed, redirected, and returned. It ended, as challenges under old code must, with one combatant incapacitated but living, because blood law prohibited killing under formal challenge conditions, and it ended with Seravaines-Morvain on his knees, and Hadrian Varcolac standing over him, breathing steadily, and looking not triumphant, but resolved, the expression of someone who has finished a thing that needed finishing. Erzsébet Vasiliev spoke the legal declaration. Ileana Draculeshti presented the cipher. 3 of Morvain's own household, given the opportunity by their lord's defeat to exercise the old code's provision for conscience testimony, confirmed specific elements of the fabricated conviction. The review was not just reopened. It was concluded in approximately 2 hours with the full exoneration of Hadrian Varcolac, commander of the First Court Sentinel Guard, and the immediate arrest of Seravaines-Morvain under blood law provisions for false conviction and the conspiracy thereof. Marcelline sat through all of it in a chair that someone had brought for her, with careful, unobtrusive courtesy. And when it was over and the chamber began to empty, she was still sitting there, processing. Hadrian found her, because of course he did, because the protective oath and 3 centuries of intent, and whatever had been building between them since a basement museum and a tunnel under London, were apparently sufficient navigational tools. He sat beside her, and they were quiet for a moment. "It is over," she said. "The formal part," he said. "There are months of legal proceedings ahead. Documentation, testimony. Morvain's household must be reviewed, and some of them will face their own proceedings." He paused. "But the part that matters most for you specifically is over. You are not hunted. You are not in danger. The protective oath is validated, and the threat that required it is removed." She absorbed this. "The oath," she said carefully. "Now that the threat is removed, the oath endures," he said. "It does not dissolve simply because the immediate threat has passed. The ancient compact is restored and remains in force." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the chamber was quiet around them in the aftermath of everything. "But the oath is not why I am sitting here." "No," she said. "I know. I am sitting here," he said. Because I have spent the past 18 hours in the company of the most extraordinary person I have encountered in 4 centuries, and I find that the idea of significant distance between us is something I have no desire to accommodate. Marcelline looked at this ancient, white-haired, silver-eyed, devastatingly powerful creature in her borrowed coat in the underground chamber of his defeated enemy, and she thought about 3 years of running, and her father's face, and the sound a stone seal makes when it breaks. And she thought about tunnels and lamplight and maps across a table and the exact way he had listened when she talked. "I am not," she said carefully, "a very easy person to be around. I have 3 years of hypervigilance and trust issues and a very ingrained habit of planning emergency exits from every room I enter. I have 300 years of immobility and an absolutely rigid personal code of honor and a tendency to assess every situation for security vulnerabilities before I can relax," he said. "We are both, I think, somewhat damaged by what has been done to us. I do not think that makes us incompatible." She smiled, and it was a real smile, and not the managed professional expression she had learned to use as a shield. It was the smile she had almost forgotten she owned. "No," she said, "I do not think it does either." He reached across and took her hand with that same certain deliberate grip that had taken her wrist in the museum basement, except that this time it was not urgency and it was not oath and it was not emergency. It was simply the careful, intentional choice of someone who does everything carefully and intentionally. She let her fingers close around his. In the weeks that followed, the formal proceedings of the vampire legal world moved through their necessary stages with the meticulous, exhaustive thoroughness of a court system that has been doing this for centuries and has developed extensive protocols accordingly. Hadrian was formally reinstated as commander of the First Court Sentinel Guard. Seravain Morvain was remanded to First Court custody pending full tribunal. 3 of Morvain's senior lieutenants entered into negotiated cooperation agreements. The secondary court beneath the embankment was formally decommissioned and its records surrendered to the First Court's archive. Ileana Draculeshti, presented with the evidence of her 3-century project finally concluded, permitted herself approximately 48 hours of visible satisfaction before returning to being the most operationally efficient person in the vampire world. The First Court's formal seat, Marcelline discovered, was beneath Edinburgh, a castle complex buried under the old town that was significantly more impressive than anything she had imagined and considerably more comfortable than its age might suggest. Because several centuries of accumulated wealth and one particularly renovation-minded sovereign in the 19th century had produced something that was simultaneously ancient and livable. Erzsébet Vasiliev received Marcelline formally on her 3rd day in Edinburgh, in a receiving room whose ceiling was painted with scenes from the 17th century, and whose chairs were comfortable in a way that suggested whoever had chosen them understood that effective governance required people to be able to sit in meetings for extended periods without developing physical grievances. Marcelline Ravenscroft, the sovereign had said. She was in person less imposing than Marcelline had anticipated, and simultaneously more so. The way that genuinely powerful people often appear smaller than their reputation until you are in the room with them and understand that the reputation has been calibrated conservatively. Your father's research was instrumental. The cipher would not have been located without the work he did. He died for it, Marcelline said. He did, and we honor that. Erzsébet's voice was measured but not cold. The Compact of 1712 is restored in full. The Ravenscroft name carries its original protection and its original standing within the First Court's formal alliances. That protection extends, under current court interpretation, to include any household the Ravenscroft heir chooses to form. She looked at Marcelline steadily. I say this not as a formality. I say it because Hadrian Varcolac has served this court with a loyalty and a dedication that outlasted everything that was done to destroy it, and whatever choice he makes about his future I intend to support without reservation. Marcelline met the sovereign's gaze. That is very clearly a message, she said. It is, said Erzsébet Vasiliev, without any self-consciousness whatsoever. I have been ruling a court for 3 centuries. Subtlety is available to me when I need it. I did not need it here. Marcelline laughed, and the sovereign smiled. and it was the beginning of what would prove to be a genuinely productive ongoing relationship between the two of them. The first time Hadrian took her to see the full extent of the first court complex, all 7 levels of it, including the library that had been accumulating since the 15th century, and the gallery of painted portraits that documented every sentinel commander since the court's founding, she stopped in front of his own portrait, commissioned before his ceiling and stored rather than destroyed, because even then Ileana had been preparing for an eventual return. He looked the same in the portrait as he did standing beside her, which was extraordinary, and the portrait managed to capture something she had only recently begun to fully see. The particular combination of authority and honor, and the deep, serious capacity for feeling that lived behind the formidable exterior. "You were quite young when this was painted," she said. He made a small sound. "I was approximately 300 years old." "Young," she said firmly, and heard the sound he made this time, which was definitely a quiet laugh. The laugh she had been working to surface more consistently ever since she first heard it in the tunnels under London. She turned away from the portrait and looked at him, at the actual living version, and said, "I want to stay." He became very still. "In Edinburgh, in this," she said, gesturing in a way that encompassed both the physical space and everything it represented. "In your world, I am not prepared to go back to whatever I was doing before. Running from things I did not understand, alone without knowing what I was protecting or what I was part of." She looked at him with the clear, direct honesty that she had given him from the museum basement onward, because she had learned too completely that anything less was a waste of the time you had. "And I am not prepared to leave you." Hadrian looked at her for a long moment, and in his silver eyes she watched something shift that was not strategy or assessment or calculation. That was simply and entirely the expression of a person confronting something they have not allowed themselves to want until the moment it was offered. "Marcelline." He said her name the way he always said it, with care and with weight, but there was something new under it now, something freed of the containment she had watched him maintain. "I am not a human man. I will not age, and you will. The world I inhabit operates by laws and codes that you are still learning, and that will complicate your life in ways neither of us can fully predict. There are members of this court who will require time to accept a human in proximity to its commander. The proceedings with Morvain will take months. The rebuilding of what I was will take longer. I know all of that," she said. "And there are solutions to some of those complications," he said carefully, "that exist within vampire law that we could discuss in time if you wanted to. I want to be clear that I am not raising them as expectations or as conditions, only as acknowledgements that they exist." She understood what he was not quite saying, because she had done 3 years of research and she had read everything she could find. And she said, "One thing at a time. Right now I am telling you that I want to stay and that I am not afraid of complicated." "You are genuinely the least afraid person I have ever encountered," he said, with a conviction that was the deepest and most sincere compliment she had ever been given. "I am afraid of plenty of things," she said. "I have simply decided that none of them outweigh the things worth moving toward." He reached out and touched her face with the deliberate, careful intention he brought to everything, and the coolness of his hand against her cheek was not cold but simply different, simply his, and she turned her face into it with the ease of something that had always been going to happen. "Then stay," he said. She stayed. The winter that followed was one of the most complex, and also one of the most quietly remarkable periods of Marcelline Ravenscroft's life, which was saying something given that the previous 3 years had contained more incident than most people see in a lifetime. She divided her time between Edinburgh and London, between the first court's formal proceedings, which she sat in on with increasing frequency as both an observer and eventually as a formal human liaison for interworld documentation questions, and the continuing work of understanding what her father had begun. She created a formal archive of the Ravenscroft research, the documents her father had gathered, and the 3 years of her own work, donated to the First Court's historical record with the stipulation that it be accessible to any researcher studying the history of the 1712 Compact and its aftermath. It was the best memorial she could give him, making sure that what he had found was not lost, that it mattered in the world. Hadrian rebuilt his command with the methodical, serious care he brought to everything that mattered to him. Working with Ileana to assess which of the Sentinel Guard's remaining members had been compromised during the centuries of his absence, rebuilding protocols, reinstating old codes, doing all of it with a clarity of purpose that she found. From the outside, genuinely moving to witness, they argued occasionally because she had convictions, and he had an extremely established operating style, and neither of them was inclined toward capitulation for its own sake, and the arguments were sharp and honest, and resolved without lasting damage, because both of them had learned in different ways that the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, was more useful than its absence. They talked for hours, because there were 4 centuries on his side and 26 years on hers, and the territory between those 2 points of view was vast and interesting, and neither of them got tired of exploring it. She learned Romanian because it seemed useful, and because the expression he made the first time she produced a correct sentence in it was worth every difficult hour of the learning process. He learned that she took her tea with exactly half a teaspoon of honey, and that she could not sleep if she had left any task genuinely undone, and that she laughed loudest at things that were only slightly funny, rather than things that were obviously so. And he catalogued all of it with the quiet attention of someone who finds the details of a specific person endlessly more interesting than any general principle. By spring, the Morvain tribunal had concluded. Seravain Morvain was sentenced under blood law to a sealed isolation of his own, not the stone imprisonment he had condemned Hadrian to, because First Court justice did not replicate the cruelty it punished, but an inescapable separation from the power structures he had built, monitored and maintained, and genuinely harmless for the first time in centuries. His secondary court was formally absorbed into the First Court's jurisdiction. His household members, those who had participated knowingly in the conspiracy, faced their own proportional consequences. Those who had served in ignorance were reassigned or released. Erzsébet Vasiliev hosted a formal court reception to mark the conclusion of the proceedings, and Marcelline stood in the Great Hall of the First Court's Edinburgh complex, in a dress she had spent 3 hours finding because she had refused to find it in less time than that. And she looked around at the assembled vampire court in all its ancient finery and thought, with a clarity that felt like something settling permanently into place, that she had stopped running. Not because the danger was entirely gone. There would always be danger in the edges of both worlds she now moved between, not because everything was resolved and simple and requiring no further attention. The logistics of her life, the questions of the future, the ongoing complexity of 2 people from entirely different kinds of existence, choosing to build something together, all of that was ongoing and would continue to be. But she had stopped running because she had found something worth stopping for. Hadrian found her in the crowd with the ease that she had come to understand was not merely the supernatural perception of a sentinel commander, but the specific, tuned awareness of someone who always knows exactly where one particular person is because that person has become the primary fixed point in their orientation of the world. He looked at her across the hall, and she looked at him, and he moved through the assembled court to reach her with the certainty of someone for whom the destination was not a consideration, but a fact. And when he reached her, he stood close enough that the warmth she had come to associate with his presence, the particular quality of space that he occupied, surrounded her. "You look," he said, in the particular voice he reserved for her, low and private in the noise of the hall, like someone who has decided something. "I have decided something," she confirmed. "Tell me, I'm exactly where I want to be," she said, "in the world I want to be in." And she paused, not from uncertainty, but from the specific pleasure of making him wait for one breath, which she had discovered he would tolerate with remarkable good grace specifically from her. With the right person. His expression did the thing she had spent months treasuring, the controlled exterior giving way to something genuine and open and entirely his, a warmth that made the silver of his eyes something other than cold, a gravity that was not weight but depth, the look of someone who has been given something they did not expect the world to give them and is not prepared to take it lightly. "The right person," he repeated. "The vampire who was sealed in stone," she said, "and the runaway who set him free." It has a certain narrative logic. It does, he agreed, though I would argue that the freeing was not unidirectional. She thought about 3 years of running, about the person she had been in that museum basement, about what it had meant to have someone simply match her stride in a tunnel under London, and say together without qualification. No, she said, it was not. He reached out and took her hand, there in the middle of the First Court's formal reception, in front of the assembled centuries of vampire aristocracy, with the absolute and unhurried certainties of someone who has decided that this specific gesture does not require privacy, because it is not a secret and has never been a secret, and will not be managed as one. She felt the deliberateness of it, the declaration in it, and she turned her hand over in his and held on. Later that night, after the reception had moved through its formal stages, and the hall had thinned to smaller groups, she and Hadrian stood on one of the complex's upper terraces that opened onto an Edinburgh night sky. The city spread out below them in light, the castle's ancient stones around them in darkness. "There is something I want to say to you," he said. She turned from the view. He was looking at her, and its expression was the most open she had ever seen it, stripped of the sentinel's careful control, offering her what lived beneath all of it. "I have lived for a long time," he said. "I have served with loyalty and fought with conviction and been removed from everything I valued by betrayal and spent 3 centuries in stone. And when the stone broke, when you were standing there in the dark with your chin up and your heart ready to argue with whatever came at you, I understood something that I had not understood before." He paused. "That the ancient vow that bound my house to your family was not a convenience of political alliance, that something deeper than politics created the connection between your bloodline and mine, and that, whatever name we give to what has grown between us since that night, it is the most certain thing I have encountered in 4 centuries of living." She crossed the small distance between them because she had never been the kind of person who waited when she knew what she wanted. His arms came around her with that same certain deliberateness, and the Edinburgh night was cold and quiet, and the stars were exactly where they had always been, and Marcelline Ravenscroft, who had spent 3 years running from something she did not understand, held on to the ancient and impossible person who had chosen her with the complete conviction of someone who has found at last the fixed point around which everything else can be organized. "I love you," she said. Simple, clear. Without qualification or management, he held her closer, and she felt his voice when he spoke, low and certain, and carrying the weight of everything that 4 centuries and 300 years of stone and 1 night in a museum basement had led to. "And I love you," he said, "in every way that has ever mattered." The spring came to Edinburgh fully over the following weeks, and with it a quality of life that Marcelline had not expected, and was entirely unprepared for in the best way, a life that was complex and meaningful and sometimes bureaucratically exhausting, and occasionally frightening in the way that all lives that matter are sometimes frightening, and completely, utterly hers. She formalized her role with the First Court as human liaison and historical consultant, a position that had not previously existed, and that she created essentially from first principles with Erzsébet Vasiliev's enthusiastic support and Ileana Draculescu's organizational efficiency. The position involved work she was genuinely good at and found genuinely absorbing, the task of building frameworks for the management of information and relationships between the vampire and human worlds, drawing on everything she had learned in 3 years of surviving at the edges of both. Her apartment in London remained, for now, because she had not entirely given up the habit of maintaining options. She visited it occasionally, more as an act of acknowledgement than genuine necessity, and each time she left it, she left more easily than the time before. The conversations she and Hadrian had about the future, about all the futures that were technically available to them, and the choices embedded in them, happened gradually and honestly and without rush, because they had agreed from the beginning that the truth was more useful than its absence, and that whatever they built together would be built on what was real rather than what was convenient. She knew what she would likely choose when the time came. She thought he knew it too, but the choosing would be hers, made in full knowledge, without pressure and without urgency, and he would wait with the particular patience of someone who has spent 3 centuries in stone and has a very precise understanding of the difference between waiting as endurance and waiting as trust. On a morning in late April, she sat at the desk in the First Court's archive room with a cup of tea and a stack of documents, and the particular quality of contentment that comes from doing work that is genuinely worth doing. And Hadrian came in with his quiet step and set another cup of tea beside hers, without comment, and without requiring comment in return, and sat beside her, and began working through his own correspondence. And the room was warm, and the archive was full of the accumulated history of a world she had entered through a museum basement and a broken seal and a 4-minute act of trust. She looked at the side of his face, absorbed in whatever report he was reviewing, white hair falling forward slightly, silver eyes moving with that inhuman reading speed, his presence beside her, as solid and certain as anything she had ever known. He sensed her looking, because he always did, and he turned, and his expression was the open, warm, specific expression that was hers, that he had given to no one else, that had taken months to earn and would never be taken for granted. "Something the matter?" he asked. "No," she said. "Everything is exactly right." She picked up her tea. He returned to his reading. The archive held its documents and its history and the accumulated weight of all the centuries that had brought them both to this room. Outside, Edinburgh continued its ancient, indifferent, magnificent existence. Below the city, the First Court moved through its business with the settled authority of something that has survived everything thrown at it and intends to continue. And Marcelline Ravenscroft, who had broken a stone seal without knowing what it would cost her and what it would give her, sat beside the vampire who had walked out of that stone and changed every calculation she had ever made about the world and her place in it, and felt, with a clarity as complete as anything she had ever known, that the running was over, that she had arrived at last exactly where she was meant to be.